Thanks, Mark. John, why don't you come up? Howard Rheingold, I would think I couldn't possibly miss you, but there you are. Get up here. And Andy Van Dam is in this room somewhere. And Alan Kay is coming in via Bean. Hey, Alan. He's in London. So if you want to ask Alan any questions, do it right at lunch. He might still be here.
Hi, John.
One question. Listening to Jeff's comments, I thought finally it settled the question of where Doug's demo was. So I want a show of hands. Who thinks the demo was in the Civic Auditorium? Raise your hands. Who thinks it, come on, and who thinks it was in Brooks Hall?
Nobody's answering any of these.
And who thinks it was somewhere else? Right. So I'm a forecaster. I will offer a professional forecast that it will be sometime during the third term of the Jenna Bush administration, and we'll still be arguing this point. John is researching it. I'm sure he will have something to say. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, I think we've had a definitive answer, although there is a Chronicle article, and you locate it in the Civic Auditorium. Terry Bardini and I located it in Brooks Hall. I think I put it where it was because of Bardini, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, Alan, can we just see if you work? We're still doing this with baling wire 50 years later. Alan, can you hear me? Do you want to say something so we can see if you're there? You know, I used to look at personal computers and say, you know, it's kind of Alan Kay in a box. Now we have Alan Kay in a box. So there's this rich debate over how technology evolves. You know, there is this school called technological determinism. You just turn a crank and technology improves. There's this other view with this really gronky name, social construction of technology, that argues there's no obvious straight line, that ideas and vision matter. And so we're going to spend the next half hour talking about the impact and the inspiration of Doug's ideas and how they change the world. Could we start, Alan? I sort of wanted to start at the beginning because you saw, I think we mentioned how Doug took the NLS demo around in 16 millimeter film first, before the demo. And I just wondered if you could, Alan, if you could talk about seeing that demo and sort of what its impact was on you.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, I was a fresh graduate student at Utah, and Doug came by, I think, in January of '67. So this would have been a year and a half or so before the big demo, almost 2 years before, maybe. And in those days, he was traveling, and I heard Jeff Wilson earlier, so he will remember this, but they had done a pretty good first pass at many of the ideas on, I think, a controlled data standalone machine. It was a single user. And they made a movie of it. And I guess in the first attempts to show the movie, they realized nobody was used to seeing their cursor on the screen. And so Doug, probably through Bill English, got a 16 millimeter Bell & Howell, a pretty substantial big blue projector, and had it modified so you could freeze the frame on it. And of course, if you did it on those projectors, it would burn the film through. So they had to add some sort of fan on it to keep it from burning the film through. But so here was this guy who was really looked like a kind of biblical prophet, this very craggy, impressive, very animated, energetic, with the 16 millimeter film thing in his hand, and he freeze the frame, and he'd go up and say, see, here's the cursor, and it's going to hit on this thing. And so the whole thing was very impressive, and I resolved to go visit using ARPA's substantial travel budget for graduate students. So I wound up flying about 140,000 miles in my 2.5 years as a graduate student on ARPA's money because Taylor wanted everybody to fly around. He used to say, don't wait until I write papers. So I got to meet the very friendly people in the Augmentation Research Center, especially Bill English and Jeff Wilson, later Bill Paxson, and got to see what they were doing. And of course, by the time I got there, they were starting work on what was going to lead to the mother of all demos. And so into '68, I had been there a few times. I had learned to use the system a little bit. I had an idea about what they were going to show, but I was also very interested in theater. And so when it came time for the demo, I had flu and a high temperature. And my girlfriend didn't want me to fly from Salt Lake to San Francisco, and I got on the plane anyway. And stories improve over time, but my recollection is showing up with a United Airlines blanket around me that I'd stolen from the plane, sitting in the audience on stage left, not too far away from the screen and all the festivities that were going on. And it was a great show. Bob Taylor had told Bill English, if you want to do the thing, just make sure it works. Do whatever is required to make sure it's absolutely foolproof. And so Bill got not just one of these incredible Ida-4 projectors, they're about the size of a Volkswagen bus. We actually turned off the vacuum pump, opened them up, and crawled inside to wipe the oil off this glass plate that circled through the stump. And Bill got not just one of those, but two of those, just in case one of them failed. It was just a big, wonderful deal, and I could tell that they had lost telemetry once during the demo, but it got picked up again, and the whole thing was as good a show as anybody's ever seen.
So I want to come back to that, Alan, but maybe we could pick up with Andy, because you were working on similar ideas and you were a bit of a skeptic. So take it from Alan to your visit. And
So I came with the following context. I had just gotten an IBM 2250 display through a grant from the New York Scientific Center, and it was about computer-aided design and scientific visualization. And then I happened by chance to meet Ted Nelson at a computer conference, whom I hadn't seen since we graduated from college at about the same time. And we asked each other what we'd been working on, and he took me through this idea of hypertext. And it really resonated with me because my PhD dissertation had used a simulation of an associative memory for doing information retrieval. Long story short, Ted spent a lot of time commuting to Brown and working with me and three of my undergraduates on what came to be known as the hypertext editing system. And it had kind of a dual nature. Hypertext, which is what Ted was all about, and I was interested in that, but I was also very much interested in what we today would call word processing, document production, and so on. I was tired of IBM Selectric typewriters, and I wanted to live online. So we did this system, and in the fall of '68, I was on some panel about graphic data structures, and almost by accident wandered into this magic show. And I was the country mouse. I was not in the DARPA community or the East Coast or West Coast computing communities. And there was this ginormous screen, which I'd heard about but never seen, and this sort of mosaic figure looming down over the audience and speaking ex cathedra and then pulling off this truly remarkable stage show. And yes, I was a skeptic. I had never seen anything that complicated, either as a show or tell. A demo to me was 3 people walk into your lab and you give them an ad hoc demo. This was bigger than any rock show you ever saw in terms of the tech and the majesty of the presentation. So afterwards, I didn't know what to make of it.
Hey, Andy,
Yeah.
remember the beginning of it, this huge stage, the blank screen, and a little guy sitting with a box in front of him, completely bare stage. And what the hell's going on? And he started speaking. He said, "I'd like to welcome you to the thing." And then Bill English hit the button, and boom, the Ida-4, 875 lines resolution, probably about 50 feet wide.
It was ginormous.
I mean, it was just the greatest thing you ever saw.
Yeah. So afterwards, I went up to Doug, and I bet I was pretty aggressive in my questioning. But Doug was the gentleman. He took it all in stride. He answered my questions completely, never losing his cool, and wound up inviting me to spend a couple of spectacular days in his lab, talking to all his people, letting me look under the covers. I was able to write about the internal mechanisms of the software in several papers. And it was really a life-altering experience for me, professionally, and in some sense also personally, because his presence was really amazing. This calmness, but yet this stage presence and this grand vision. And while I'm on the subject of grand vision, a heartfelt thank you to prior pioneers. Lick has been mentioned, Lick Leiter, Ivan Sutherland, who got me started in graphics, Ted, who got me thinking about information and communication, and of course hyperlinks, and Alan Kay, whose amazing work, which we all know about, has inspired me personally as well as affecting the entire industry.
Andy, is
Andy?
Alan showing a picture of what you looked like at the time?
If I can,
In his imagination. The reality was somewhat different, as is not
so these are
atypical with Alan.
These are sketches I just did in the last couple of days. But I have a very crisp visual memory. This is what the wild man Van Damme looked like when he was 30 years old.
It was the 1960s. So, Andy, one more question before. So, in the immediate aftermath of seeing that, how did it affect your research back on the East Coast?
Can I just go online for a minute?
Briefly, not too long, but go ahead.
No, I know. So this is sort of a pre-alpha version of our latest hypermedia system. Since Ted turned me on and then Doug took it to the next level, I've been involved with about 6 different ones, including some commercial ones. This has the usual panning and zooming of an unbounded workspace, and one of the features on here is a kind of Prezi-style presentation trail that you can lay through any number of these documents. So here's the hypertext editing system. 3 undergraduates working part-time with Ted and me versus this army of people, money and equipment. Boy, was I jealous. But they did amazing things with their resources. Now, Fress was the successor, and we had started it designing in the summer of '68, and I came back with my mind blown from watching the mother of all demos, and I said, guys, no good. Our vision is much too small. We have to completely rethink. And essentially, Fress was a memory hog, hence the name, is amalgam of best ideas that I got from Ted and from Doug and his crew. It had a lot of the same features, and we actually managed to resurrect the binaries that ran in the 60s, and during lunch, Dave Durand, who was the great resurrector, will do a live demo of Fress, and the poetry database, which was an experiment in a poetry course where we had what I believe to be the world's first online community doing all their reading, writing, critiquing through the medium of our system. That and multiple others in turn led to Intermedia, which Norm Meyerowitz was the chief architect of. He has it up and running, another amazing resurrection on 27-year-old Apple equipment with the original software, and you can see that during lunch and afterwards. And then the system that we're currently building that I'm displaying this on. So we've been here a very long time, my ever-changing group and I have to say I owe a ton of, especially the larger vision. What is it going to be used for? What are the use cases? How will it affect society, to the way Doug thought about everything from the highest level of abstraction down to the gory details.
So that's great, thank you. Howard, I actually went last night and I went to the Internet Archive and I checked out Tools for Thought, which is sort of wonderful about the Internet Archive. You should use it as a library if you aren't. You really got it all. I mean, I didn't really remember the sweep of computing that you got in that book, but Tools for Thought, it looked like NLS was very much the sort of one of the major influences. And I was just wondering, was that true? And how did you stumble across NLS?
Well, it really grew out of my encounter with Doug Engelbart. Like Andy, I was looking for a better typewriter. Not an electrical engineer, not a programmer, but somehow that brought me to Alan Kay's 1977 article in Scientific American. And it noted that he had worked at a place called Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And that seemed like an extraordinary place for a writer who's interested in technology. I was also interested in mind and mind amplification, consciousness expansion, although I wasn't really thinking about that then. And there was a woman at Park by the name of Gloria Warner, who was their public affairs director, and she was very kind. I called her once a week to ask if she had any work for me, and finally she did, and I got my foot in the door there and kind of talked my way into writing articles about interesting things going on there. And that brought me to Bob Taylor, and Bob Taylor directed me to Engelbart's paper, which I read in their library, and that was, for many people here, the demo was a transformative experience. For me, that was a transformative experience, and I reread it, and I recommend rereading it because it's a really deep document. And I used to, I assigned it to my Stanford students, and in fact, I had Doug come in and talk to them a couple of times. But when I went out to meet him, it was when he was working in a little building surrounded by the Apple campus. I think it was TimeNet was the name of the company, and he told his story. And like everybody else, I was recruited to this vision, but I realized immediately that this was not just a better typewriter. This was a mind amplifier, and maybe I'll say something about that later, but I think the non-technological part of his vision is extraordinarily important and unrealized, and there are, I think, some really interesting developments happening around that these days.
I wanted to ask about sort of dead ends as well. Charles Irby talked about seeing the demo and how he came and got a job, and that was really quite remarkable. You sent a student from one of your students to work with Doug for a summer or maybe longer, and then he went off into the woods and became a hippie. There was that sort of personal thing. Ultimately he came back and was involved in the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so maybe it did have an impact in the long run. But did you send him there to get, what was the intent of sending? Terry Gross is the person who went to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The intent was simply that he would get educated at a much higher plane than we could provide because, again, of the incredible resources, history, and just amazing quality and quantity of work that was going on there.
Yeah.
So it was a good part of his education. I hoped he'd come back and carry some of the information back to us so that we could go to the next level ourselves.
It was an example of augmentation in a different way. I think when he moved up to Eugene, he took the name Lightning Clearwater.
Yep. And he's still called Lightning by his wife.
So, Alan, another sort of path in was the Polos system, which Xerox started to build before your work sort of took over around Smalltalk and the Dynabook. Can you tell us a little bit about Polos and to what extent it owes its lineage to NLS?
Yes, well, when Taylor came to Park in September 1970 and recruited a few people. He hired me as a consultant, got a couple of people from Utah. He got Butler Lampson and the BCC people as an entire critical mass of about 12 people in January of 1971. And so there was enough talent to do pretty much anything. And the other thing that had happened right around that time was that Intel was starting to make available the first VLSI RAM memory. And the import was 1,024 bits on a chip. But compared to core memory, it was just the most incredible change in leverage, because with it, a few smart people could build a relatively large and complicated computer. And so one of the things that was decided early on, because we were all friends in the ARPA community was quite friendly, quite amazingly friendly. And so the descriptions from the outside, the way you characterize it isn't quite the way it was. Everybody knew what anybody else was doing, because we were all out, always out drinking beer and having lunch and playing tennis and every other kind of thing. So one of the earliest things that we thought would be a good thing to do would be to do the next logical version of NLS. Not that system, but the next thing that would make sense in the 1970s, and to do it in collaboration with the augmentation research group at SRI. So there was actually a joint project, an official joint project that used people from both sides there. And this was written up in these famous Hendry papers for park planning purposes that outline this in some detail. Jim Mitchell wrote a pretty good paper on NLS itself about what this next project is going to be. And it involved various ways of distributing function that wouldn't be done on a single mainframe. And so that is the way the thing started. And what happened was some strife that we who were at Park were not part of. But the result of that strife was a bunch of very, very good people, including Bill English and Jeff and other people from SRI, decided they wanted to come over to Park. Taylor didn't try to get them over here, but when they asked about it, that was like the best idea anybody had ever had. And I owe a lot of my career at Park to Bill English, because he took me under his wing and showed me a little bit about how to be a manager. Yeah. So it was all very friendly. And the Polos thing almost worked. It was actually an extremely interesting idea. And I think if we'd been able to build all the hardware for Polos, we could have made that idea work. It was a distributed function system using Novas. And anyway, I won't go into the details.
Yeah.
But those display housings that are familiar to people who've seen pictures of the Alto, they're downstairs in the building you're in. Those are Polos terminals. They're actually too large for the Alto. Those were made for a 1,000-line video that Polos was going to do. And so it had the 15-inch monitors, whereas the Altos can only sustain really a 12-inch monitor. So the Altos don't look as good as we were originally planning to do them because we didn't have enough money in the Alto to do our own display house. And Bill had already gotten the molds made for molding the aluminum and everything else, and so we just decided to use that. So this is one of these things where the outside views that this is, something got taken over, something got superseded. It's just part of doing edge of the art stuff, like playing baseball, where 70% of the time you don't get a hit. It's not failure, it's just an overhead for doing the hard stuff. And what we did get out of the whole Polos project was all the font design and the thing called the old character generator and the fonts for the laser printer and a whole bunch of other things. And those people at Hart did, for my money, one of the most important systems, especially that nobody's ever heard of, which was called Office a few years later, which is just a remarkable set of conceptions.
So I want to also ask about the interaction between NLS and the ARPANET. And if anybody hasn't read RFC 1 and RFC 2, I know they were mentioned, you really should go read them because you get a deep sense of how NLS was really at the heart of the very early ARPANET. And can you trace that thread, Howard, and sort of, because hypertext was right there at the beginning, and how did they interact?
Well, I think it's kind of hard to unwind this thread without unwinding the whole thing, but knowledge is a network, and humans communicate in networks. And I remember Engelbart being unhappy with the Mac because it was no longer connected to the others. So the ability to jump from piece of knowledge to piece of knowledge, and the ability to connect people together were inextricable parts of that vision. And I think part of the larger vision of the way humans have evolved culture. And I think he would agree today that what he was thinking about was situated in that larger span that Mark Webber showed us. And I think what he didn't understand was that the way it had happened before was slow, and what he was and he was impatient about something that's probably going to take generations to work out.
So I want to also ask about computing as metaphor, and the three of you feel free to correct me on this, but my memory is that Doug sort of saw the metaphor of being at a computer console and driving through cyberspace, and where Alan broke with Doug is that he saw computing as a media. And I wonder if that's right, and if you can actually take those as ways of framing where we went or where we're going.
Well, I never broke with Doug, but it's one of the things that's fun about the original proposal, which I urge everybody who hasn't read it to read it. That was what influenced me, because what the guys did with the NLS and the demo was a tour de force in its day and quite wonderful. And this is not to denigrate it in any way at all, but there are lots of wonderful things going on in the ARPA community right then. There's still one of the world's greatest pen-based systems called Grail, which was going on. Sketchpad had been done. The most important things about, actually, Brett Victor had a great remark about Doug on a little reflection he wrote. It's online. After Doug passed away, he said he always got the impression that when journalists interviewed Doug, it was like they're interviewing George Orwell and asking most of the questions about Orwell's typewriter. Because people are so fascinated with the technology, they miss. But if you read the original proposal, The metaphor he had in there was most uses of computers are like people riding on trains, and even the drivers of the computers are like the engineers of the train and their tracks, and your job is to assist this mechanism. And Doug's metaphor was not driving a car. He changed that later, but in that proposal, his metaphor was give the human a bulldozer. So, power to go wherever you wanted to was the way he thought about it. And what's in that proposal is, to me, the best summary, even including Licklighters, from that time and most times about why we should be worried about doing personal computing and what we should be worried about when we're doing it. And there, the comparisons between what was shown in the Big Demo and what we have today are mostly quite wrong. So they point to the interaction with Bill Paxton, for instance, on the screen as being kind of like what I'm doing right now. But in fact, it isn't like even what you can do with Skype and using Google Docs, because in NLS, everybody had their own cursor. You were actually an equal user of the space that you were collaborating in. And none of the collaboration systems that are around today that I know of have gotten that idea yet, or the idea to build collaboration into the operating system. And the same thing is true for most of the things that are looked at as precursors to what we have today. In fact, they were a superset in most cases of what we have today. If you go to the 1962 proposal, you find something that is a real superset. And I think anybody who has read this has to be impressed with the breadth of the way Doug was thinking. Just to finish this off, I think one of the reasons that Doug has not been very well understood, and in particularly in forums like this, is he was basically a systems guy through and through. He thought about everything in terms of multiply connected systems and dependencies and feedback loops. And you basically can't describe it orally. It's not an oral culture kind of thing. It's not something that fits into a story. It's something that requires at least diagrams. It requires interactions, negotiations, and a whole different way of presentation. In fact, ironically, requires a presentation form like what they were trying to do, not what we have today. That's the irony of it.
Howard, did you want to?
Well, I just want to make sure to get something in while we still have time,
Yeah, we're running out of
which
time.
is that to emphasize the foresight around the HLAMT that Gardner talked about, that we all recognize his foresight about the technology, but the understanding of the, and he talked about coevolution, the understanding of the coevolution between the way people think and communicate and the tools that we design is much better understood now, but he really centered his work on that. And if you look at, there was a Scientific American edition very recently about how we are human, science of being human. There's a book by Joe Henrich from Harvard called The Secret of Our Success. And you know, to extremely condense it, we, among the many hominins, managed to dominate, not necessarily because of our big brains or our tool use, although those were certainly part of the system, but because of our collective intelligence system, our culture, everything that we weren't born with, that someone learns and teaches somebody else. We're human also not just because we learn, but because we teach. And he was talking about, when he was talking about bootstrapping, he was talking about accelerating a system that had accelerated before Homo sapiens. If you think about the use of fire for cooking, that augmented our ability to digest and that enabled our brains to grow larger because they weren't needed for our stomachs, and also we didn't have to have these big teeth. But the invention of speech and writing, all of the things that the symbol manipulation he talked about, and then automatic symbol manipulation, part of a coevolution that's taken a very long time, longer than Homo sapiens, and it's only now, I think, is the social part of what he was talking about beginning to be recognized.
Andy, you have enough distance. I mean, critique this idea that the initial influence of Doug's ideas playing out at Xerox PARC, and then Adele Goldberg famously giving Steve and a group of people from Apple a demo and it going away to Apple in the form of Lisa and Macintosh, and Charles Simoni taking a business plan to Microsoft in the form of Office. Is that the right way to look at the diffusion of the ideas?
Well, there's certainly a direct lineage that you can trace of ideas and implementations, but I think many of us who feel the revolution is unfinished sort of think of the funnel thing. There was a huge scope at the beginning, and then with each successive implementation, you get maybe a little broadening in some directions, but overall a narrowing. And what we have today is silos. We have applications that don't interoperate, and what was so fantastic about NLS, and subsequently also in Alan and Adele, et cetera's Smalltalk ecosystem at PARC, is that it was all integrated from the ground up, and that everything worked with everything else. And so that part of the lineage, I think, has really been narrowed out in today's environment. And yes, our collective intelligence has been raised by having better tools, but the kind of transformation of society and organizations that Doug was all about in his vision, I don't think has been realized as yet. Yeah. So I kind of look at it as the glass is half full. It's been a lot of progress, but we've lost a lot.
Howard, how about, what's your thought about that sort of commercialization of Doug's ideas in the form of the Apple, Macintosh, Lisa, and...
Well, there are two aspects to it. One is what you need to do to turn out a product, and that's, of course, embedded in selling the product, is embedded in capitalism. But I think also the systemic nature of what was done at SRI and what was done at PARC, we don't really have social mechanisms for that work very well. All of our institutions for creating knowledge, from the private laboratory to the university, reward specialization. And there's an opportunity cost when you step out of your specialty to engage in interdisciplinary work. And Doug had the opportunity to bring software and hardware people and psychologists together in one place. If you could have the funding to do it and bring people together from a lot of different fields, I think you would have a different outcome than trying to find a product that you could afford to produce and sell.
We are out of time. Thank you. Thank you, Alan, from all of you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, gentlemen.